Hello, welcome to all of those of you who braved the weather to come join us today, and also to our online audience. We really appreciate you joining us. My name is Tara Watson. I direct the Center for Economic Security and Opportunity here at Brookings. And I'm here because about a year ago, Abby McCloskey, who you'll hear from in a moment, asked me to join a project. It was under the auspices of the Convergence Collaborative, which I didn't know much about. But the goal was to discuss policies to support working families. And I quickly learned that this approach was really serious about bringing together people from across the ideological spectrum and about facilitating productive conversation. So several dozen of us spent quite a bit of time over the past year producing a report, which you'll hear a bit about today, especially in the first panel. But then because the process was so unusual, I wanted to give people the opportunity to hear more about work across the ideological spectrum more generally. And so our second panel will be focusing on productive ways to do that. We'll have two panels. We're going to pack a lot in. So we'll only have time for a few questions. But I hope you all will stay for the reception at the end of the event outside and continue the conversation there. And before I turn things over to Abby, who will introduce the report, I'm going to introduce all of our panelists, starting with the second panel, which is called Finding Common Ground on Polarizing Issues. The panelists will include Stuart Butler, who's a senior fellow in economic studies here at Brookings. Before joining Brookings, Stuart spent 35 years at the Heritage Foundation. He was the director of the Center for Policy Innovation and vice president of domestic and economic policy studies there. Maya McGinnis will also be on the second panel. She is the president of the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. She oversees the committee's Fiscal Institute, the Fix the Debt Coalition, and Fix US, which is a project which seeks to better understand and address the root causes of our nation's divisions and deteriorating politics. Lindsay Tirico is Senior Vice President of the Bank Community Engagement and Executive Director of the American Bankers Association Foundation. She previously was a vice president of policy and advocacy at United Way Worldwide, where she expanded United Way's nonpartisan civic engagement and community empowerment efforts. That second panel will be moderated by New York Times reporter Jessica Gross, who is an opinion writer for The Times, covering family education and social issues. She joined The Times as a founding editor of the parenting section in 2018, and then moved on to the opinion section in 2021. And she is the author of Screaming on the Inside, The Unsustainability of American Motherhood. Before we hear from that wonderful group, we will have the first panel, 4 areas of common ground for working families. That will be moderated by Molly Kinder, who is a fellow here at Brookings in the Metro group. She examines the future of work and low-wage work, especially for women and workers of color. She previously was a non-resident senior fellow at New America and the director of research for its Workers and Technology Initiative. And she is also adjunct faculty at Georgetown University. Lena Guzman is the chief strategy officer at Child Trends and director of its Hispanic Institute. She is responsible for increasing Child Trends' impact and leading strategic business development. She is a principal investigator of the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, where she oversees a large research agenda across family well-being, poverty, and economic self-sufficiency, and other issues. The third person on the panel will be Josh McCabe. He's the director of social policy at the Niskanen Center, previously an assistant professor of sociology and assistant dean for social sciences at Endicott College. And he wrote a book in 2018, The Fiscalization of Social Policy, How Taxpayers Trumped Children in the Fight Against Child Poverty. And last but not least, I'll introduce Abby McCloskey, who directed the project with Convergence on supports for working families. She is the founder and principal of research of McCloskey Policy LLC, and previously was program director of economic policy at the American Enterprise Institute. And she is going to lead us off with a few remarks about the project overall before we get into our panels. So please join me in giving everyone a warm welcome, and I hope to talk with you more at the reception.
Thank you so much, Tara, and to all of you for being here. So appreciative. In 2017, I was a member of a Brookings working group on paid leave with AEI, and that experience taught me two things. One was the power of relationships. A lot of us who are in that group are still in touch and doing projects together today. Some were part of this effort. And the other was the power of a bipartisan group to develop something new, and not just to reduce to the lowest common denominator. And those learnings and aspirations from Brookings carried over into this Convergence project, and I'm so grateful for that. How to support families with young kids has been the heart of my professional and personal work. I've researched family policy for the last 15 years, and I have 3 young children myself. They're 8, 6, and 3. And like so many parents and researchers, I've long felt that there's something in our culture that rubs up against parenthood. That makes it harder than an already hard thing needs to be, and in many ways more challenging than generations before us. We see evidence of this throughout the data, in parents' declining optimism about the future for their kids, in the relatively small and shrinking share of the federal budget that goes to children, people increasingly opting out of family formation, sometimes citing costs, rising infant and maternal mortality rates, and books like Family Unfriendly and The Anxious Generation. The aim of our Convergence project was not to rename those challenges or to embark on new research, which so many groups, including Brookings, have done well. Rather, it was to bring together leaders in family policy across political ideologies to find common ground. And that's because whether we're talking about Build Back Better or the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there are radically different political approaches for supporting families and a very large relational, political, organizational chasm between them. This project was about one small bridge-building organization named Convergence, who I was so proud to partner with, taking a step to bridge the gap on family policy in particular. So the project was always going to succeed or fail based on who was around the table. And we chose members for the collaborative first and foremost based on their expertise in the area of children and families. But the second criteria was choosing people who we knew had deep policy and political differences, who testify against each other, whose organizations are set up in opposition to each other, who appear on opposite opinion pages in our major papers. And we wanted to include our think tank voices, but diversify out to also include employers, nonprofits, physicians, and folks from different parts of the country. Our group of 32, which I would say was on the verge of manageable, met monthly over the course of a year, both remotely and in person. We had a professional mediation team to keep things civil, and I often joked that our meetings felt like couples therapy. And we intentionally waited before jumping into policy, which is something that's actually very hard for policy people to do. But we started instead by building a framework for family flourishing. And in the end, I think this ends up being one of the most powerful parts of the report because it gives a new way of thinking and talking about family well-being across party lines and brings in other dimensions, such as relational connectedness that can get left out of traditional policy conversations. Our recommendations came from this framework, and government solutions are certainly part of it. We'll talk about them, but not all of it. We also had recommendations for employers and philanthropy and communities. And these fell into 4 main categories, which I'll go through briefly, and then we'll share more on the panel. The first is changing the story. The last national pulse we had on child well-being was in 1991. It was the published report of the National Commission on Children that had been signed into law by Reagan in '87. And the title of this report was Beyond Rhetoric, with the kind of subtext being enough talking, let's get on to fix these things. And our group kept returning to the importance of language and rhetoric in nearly every conversation we had. And that's why this leads the report. We put forward new narratives in it, but also recommended interventions to move the well-being of families forward in our national conversation and dialogue. So this includes things like launching a public narrative campaign to raise awareness about the importance of early childhood. A similar effort to this is happening in the UK right now. Focusing policymakers' attention on children and families through new structures. This could be a family caucus or committee, or reinstating a National Commission on Children for the 21st century, or establishing a cross-partisan fact base for understanding family flourishing, because we're often looking at different data and polling depending on our own political leanings and our organizations. The second area of intervention was rethinking cash support for families. And we write in the report that low to moderate income families with young children should receive more effective and easy to access cash support while acknowledging fiscal realities. And this includes reforms such as increasing intergenerational equity in our budget, which is to say reallocating a greater share of our existing spending to kids. Exploring the timing of child tax credit payments to direct a relatively larger share to families with younger children, as well as directing relatively more to lower income families. And encouraging state and local experimentation with cash support. So one of the examples we cite is RX Kids, which is being piloted in Flint, Michigan, where a pregnant mom and in the first year of her baby's life will receive $7,500, mostly funded by charitable donations. So we encourage more experimentation like that. The third area we looked at was ensuring more high quality care options for children. And this area was arguably where we had some of our largest disagreements, and yet some of our most deeply held desires to break out of what it can be a pretty reflexive one-size-fits-all solution of either full-time center-based care or stay-at-home parenting. Our collaborative called for a new holistic care agenda for young children, and said that parents should have access to care choices that align with their needs and values in their child's development. This includes making workplaces more accommodating for parents, increasing families' access to a range of childcare options through non-traditional child care supports like zoning reforms and structures that streamline funding access for parents and providers, and ensuring that the existing state block grant, the largest of which is CCDBG, is funded at a level so that any eligible child under the federal guidelines can receive the support that they've been promised. The fourth and last was supporting parents with adopted children and infants. And we were able to reach our strongest language here. We said that the status quo around birth and infancy is not acceptable. Most in our group supported a national paid parental leave plan of at least 12 weeks. And this is the longest duration for leave put forward by a bipartisan working group that we were aware of. And investing in more holistic prenatal and postpartum supports, whether that's increasing the access to telemedicine for Medicaid or expanded home visits in communities. We'll hear more about these and others in the panel, but before I do, they are not here, but I want to thank the Packard Foundation, who invested in this project well before they knew where such a diverse group would end up. I want to thank the leadership of the Convergence team, who's in the back, who tirelessly do this work across all sorts of different issues, and it was such a privilege to see up close and be part of. For Jess Gross, who sat in on a particularly feisty session in November of our group and covered the workings of it in the Times, and to Tara, Lena, and Josh, who I've been privileged to get to know and were such valuable parts of this collaborative. And lastly, to Brookings for hosting this event. It's such a privilege to be back. Thank you.
Abby, thank you so much for that amazing introduction. It was wonderful to hear what motivated you to be part of this effort and some of your previous work in bridging the divide here at Brookings. I'm curious to hear from Josh and from Lena. What inspired you to join this effort, and what brought you to the table?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was actually looking at the invitation yesterday. I wanted to make sure that my memory is correct. So obviously the invitation, the topic, right? Working to support working families, that always is appealing. But the invitation really stood out in, I think, 3 different ways. One is that this ideological spectrum, also just diversity from perspectives. So we had business sector represented, we had nonprofits, advocacies, organizations. Having so many different perspectives and experiences brought to the table was unusual. I often get invitations for technical working groups or expert panel groups, but it's often a lot of conversation and not a lot of action, and we don't really know where does all that great discussions go. And I see Tara shaking her head because I'm pretty sure that's a familiar experience. But what I also stood out was that it was a clear action-oriented sort of mission that the group came, and it came with a year-long commitment. So you knew that they were serious about getting to actionable goals and actionable recommendations. So that really appealed to me as well.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you get an invitation from Abby, that's always a good sign that it's going to be a good project. But I was really excited to get in the room with folks who, in a previous life, I was an academic. I had read about different groups, different organizations, different folks within them. But to be in the room with them and be able to talk to them in a seminar-style format that was off the record, you could ask about anything, push back, add on. That's not an opportunity you get a lot, I think, in Washington. So it wasn't one that I was going to pass up.
Abby laid out 4 main buckets of focus areas, and underneath that, quite a few different policy areas. Why do you think it was important that this project took all of that together holistically? And what does that say about the convergence process? What was important about this sort of totality of issues? I'd love to hear from you too. Maybe Abby?
Sure. So I've been part of working groups, I'm sure you all have too, where you go in and there's a mission to talk about childcare and come out with a policy solution, and a month later you'll have a report. And the nature of this was completely different. We had the parameters to focus on supports for working families with young children, but beyond that, there wasn't any specific area of focus. And I think having that broad of a mission for our group all of a sudden makes some of the little individual pieces feel less big to some extent, and so it leads to having a more talking about what government can do and employers and philanthropy, but also talking beyond one policy solution, and kind of putting yourself more in the perspective of the reality that families face and what would really most benefit them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, that where we landed was absolutely not set in stone from the outset. We had a very broad agenda. But I think it was implicit in the design that we landed where we did. So the idea that we would have just tackled one issue, just given the wide, given the composition of the group, the different perspectives and sectors, I think it was just unlikely that we would have landed there. And it's a good thing because we know that what families do not function in silos. They don't have siloed needs. And so I think that where we landed really reflects the fact that families' needs are complex, and they really do need, what they need are supports around time, money, and care supports and caregiving.
Yeah, I think when the budget comes out, everyone sort of runs to see what their policy area got, right? And it can sometimes feel like you're competing with other policy areas. And to put them all together and really force us to say, okay, what are the strengths here? What are the weaknesses here? If we have to consider these things holistically, we have to figure out what's really important, what are some of the impediments or the obstacles, and where do we have that broad agreement? Because as Lena said, it's a holistic approach to families, and getting out of that single policy space to think that way was really, really helpful.
So I've heard several references to how unique this convergence process was. I'd love to hear a little more reflection about what about this process felt different from the way you maybe would normally work individually on these topics, and what were some of the hardest or most challenging and also most rewarding aspects?
So I would start, I think typically what I've seen is that we take on one topic. So would it be childcare, EITC? So we have lots of specialists in the room. And I think what stood out again was the divergence of perspectives, the industries that were represented. Absolutely a key ingredient was that facilitated discussions, because with 30 people, very strong opinions, I don't see how that would have been able to move forward had we not had this incredible facilitated conversations. And I remember some days just saying, oh, we're never going to agree to anything. And then hearing sort of the key takeaways that our facilitators would summarize at the end. And I'm like, oh, we did say that. We did agree. So I think, those two things were just really critical.
Yeah, I think we all go in with our policy specialty, and we're ready to just talk about that. And I think Abby had her hands full trying to say, no, we're not going to talk about policy yet. We got to think about first principles. What sort of conversation do we want to have? What are we talking about here? Before we got into that. And that was really important to help us step back from our usual policy wonk, very, very narrow way of thinking. And also be able to talk to people off the record with just nothing in particular. So usually you call somebody up, hey, I have a new report. I want to talk to you about my report. Or I want you to take a look at this thing I'm working on. And, that's helpful, but it doesn't allow for those broader conversations of what are your thoughts on X, Y, and Z, whatever comes up in the conversation. It's a bit more organic. You go places you probably wouldn't expect to go.
And for me, I would say it was the intentional slowness that was both, I think, created the space to have the conversations we did and creativity, and was also frustrating at times. And that we did try our best to be a neutral space. Again, I've been part of groups that are all conservative with a token progressive, or all progressive with a token conservative, and those don't feel like really a safe place to actually say why you think what you do. And so we really strove to have a very balanced group, to have a private place that wasn't performative, to meet again and again and again, share meals, and build relationships. And ultimately, those are really hard to measure, but I think that's what's really missing right now in some of our political conversations.
Right, last question before I open it up to the audience. What would be your biggest priority for family policy coming up in the year ahead? And I know we're in an election year, so is there one particular issue that is top of mind for you?
I'll start. If I had of the three that we put forth, for me it would be childcare. I think just COVID really shone a light at just how broken our childcare system is, and how much how critical it is. We know it's critical for families and working parents. We know that it can do really help support children's development, high quality childcare. And, it's so linked to family economic well-being. If we don't, if you're on your way to work and suddenly your childcare center is not open, some of us have the luxury of being able to work from home. And for many, it really means a missing paycheck that you're not making. So it's also really tied to economic well-being.
Yeah, I think with 2025 coming up in all the debates around the tax package, we're really thinking about the child tax credit and what that should look like, what it could look like, and what are some broader reforms we can integrate to help make that so it's a bit more generous. It's helping families across the income spectrum, and it's not going to break the bank. So we want to make sure that this is something sustainable for families, that they have it in good times and in bad, and it helps them afford just the cost of raising kids.
And I'm excited about the bipartisan bicameral working groups in Congress for paid leave and the bipartisan CTC negotiations. But what I'd really love to see is a reinstating of the National Commission on Children for the 21st century. It's been decades. The well-being of children and families has arguably gotten worse. Our polarization has too. And I think having a bipartisan national commission to address it would be a huge step forward.
Great. Do we have any questions from the audience for our panel? I think we have a microphone coming.
Hi, Chris McRae. I'm not sure if this is for this panel or the next one, but I was interested, did you review the sort of flow of education as part of your process? Because my daughter grew up in Montgomery County, and we went through 6 different schools, and each time there was another test or sort. Nothing ever fitted, and everywhere she went from one place where she was bullied to the next. And so there's something very wrong with the education system, at least for girls.
Well, and that was something that was so frustrating in some ways about this process, because education was an area we didn't have scope to get into. Child poverty was an area, tech and teen mental health, and we intentionally focused on young kids, up through early elementary school, because that is such a historic area of underinvestment in the country, and education is a bigger conversation that would have required different people around the table to address adequately.
Hi, great discussion, and Josh is my boss, so big fan of Josh too. Quick question, as someone who works around the Hill, I've been privileged to see firsthand just the really strong center-left, center-right coalitions on issues like paid leave and the child tax credit. which owe a lot to many of the folks involved in the working group. Childcare space, I know there's probably room for more maturity there, so I'd love a bit more elaboration on kind of sort of the creative, transpartisan, preliminary ideas you had to recreate that sort of coalition building in a new area.
I guess I can answer.
I'm happy to take it.
Yeah, so I think the collaborative was actually really helpful, and in some of the relationships we built there, I've since reached out to folks and have written some policy ideas and run some different panels based on those conversations that we had. So it really broadened my thinking and opened those doors where we can have some of those broader conversations about care choices, pluralism, what do different folks need, what's plausible, possible. So I think the collaborative was really helpful, particularly in that space.
Yeah, and in some ways, even the language around that section not being called the child care section, but creating more care options for families, I don't think I'd fully appreciated before going into this process how even that type of language can be pretty off-putting to some folks in the more conservative side of the spectrum. So again, talking about it as a broader issue of care was something that we did in the group.
There's another hand. Yes.
Hi, Craig Obie from the Convergence Leadership Council. Question for you, because this wonderful work that's been done, the challenge is always when it gets into the policy process, there are the political pressures that folks who were having private conversations in those rooms are going to confront. I'm just curious how you see the ability of folks, the inclination of folks who were involved to help carry this forward in that process.
Well, I mean, I think that we've continued to be, several of us continue to be in touch. Josh just mentioned a couple of ways. And I also think that I think the message of what the convergence model has done, I think is also when I've either done media interviews or talked at places, that's what is it about this? What's the secret sauce that seems to really have helped break through? Because we need more of that in such a polarized environment that we live in.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm encouraged. We are seeing some of those bipartisan efforts happening in Congress in real time. They don't always rise to the level of, the Trump-Biden rematch, but they're happening. There's a large group of people who want to see change in this space. And so continuing to advance conversation at the federal level, but then there's a tremendous amount happening at the state and local level, too, in this regard, whether it's blue states or red states or purple states, and also among employers who are members of our group. And what can, Amazon and Walmart and the Chamber were all part of our table. Kind of what are the steps that the private sector can also take in helping support families? So it crossed a number of different dimensions, but I think kind of the actual ground that it's hitting is pretty fertile for reform right now.
Maya.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Maya McGinnis on the next panel. And I apologize because I feel like my question is not in the spirit of Convergence, which is a group that I participated in, and the process is amazing. And it's about what you can come together around. But I also think it's useful to know where the kind of parts you could get stuck on an issue that aren't constructive are. So were there any proposals that everyone thought was a terrible idea that get lots of attention, or that were particularly divisive, that like one side loved and the other side didn't like? So more as a warning, these are not the things that bring people together around this issue.
Well, we can't possibly end here, Maya. So you have to set up.
There should be one more upbeat question.
I do think the childcare space was particularly contentious. I think that, no surprise to anyone here who follows the child tax credit negotiations and the implications on work, were contentious. I think one of the surprising pieces that we ended up leaving out of the report was not including the economic implications of some of our family-friendly reforms for supporting women's work or gender equity, that actually got left out of the final report with intention because it became an area that the group couldn't agree on. And had a lot of discussions about if the end goal of family support, is it for economic stability, is it for the adults, is it for the kids? And ultimately the the facts in the report, the proposals are child-focused for the most part. So that was another area that was contentious.
And I think we also, very quickly, also there are some groups of children that we did leave off the table. So, for example, the fact that this is a report about working families and policies aimed at supporting work and families. So we left out children whose families, are not able to be stably employed. We did leave that out, and that includes a substantial number of children who are in deep, have some of the highest needs. So those were some things that I read the report and I know those moments and I agree with why we went there, but it's still, not something that I particularly love still.
I have a question in the back.
Wendell Primus with Brookings. I just wanted to follow up on the discussion. I've had one foot in the health world and one foot in my family in the education world, and I'm shocked by the salary difference between a nurse and a teacher, and that goes through Head Start, childcare, et cetera, and you mentioned it. Can you say anything more about what needs to be done to the salary levels? And the final question is, did you say anything about child welfare policies and the amount of abuse of our children, which is primarily neglect and addiction?
Yeah, and on the latter, a hugely important issue. And again, one of those where the scoping of this project didn't allow us to get into the foster system and abused and neglected kids. And maybe we can do another version of it where we can. Again, so another area of debate following up to Maya's was the childcare workforce. And that kept coming up too, and is notably, there's references to it in the report, but it's not a focus. And I guess that would be my answer to the question about salary disparities between a healthcare worker and a childcare worker, or between just at this point, a retail or fast food worker and a childcare worker. We went into the recommendations for supporting families from the parent-child perspective, and less from kind of exogenous in, if that makes sense, from the workforce. So that was something that we didn't address in our report. I don't know if y'all have things to add to that.
Oh, and I would also add that you're absolutely right. The issue around wages for the EC work, for the early childcare workforce is a big one. It's also very closely tied with issues around equity, gender equity, but also racial equity. So a large portion of our workforce in the childcare space are Black and brown women who are just, historically been underpaid. But this is also a place where a lot of states are innovating. And I was going to bring Molly in. I know that you're our moderator, but I know that there are many states that are really leading the charge here in addressing this and seeing this as a necessary condition to really expand and build the childcare market.
Right. I have a project here at Brookings looking at issues around the care workforce. And I think what is interesting with this conversation is I think there's an argument to be made, and I know you couldn't do everything in one report. So in one year, this is a bigger project, but there is an argument to be made that some of the benefits of raising pay for the childcare workforce really is for the families as well. It's an equity issue because it's a vastly underpaid workforce that's disproportionately Black and brown and women, but also from the perspective of families looking for childcare, there's huge childcare shortages, and it's very difficult for these childcare centers to attract a workforce when, as Abby, you were referencing, it often pays more to go across the street to a Home Depot or a CVS than to have, what we pay our childcare workforce. So it's an interesting one for me that whether or not that was sort of in the scope, and if it wasn't for lots of reasons, I'm curious if there's any sense from the conversations you had as a group of partisan differences on this front. As we just heard, there is a lot of really interesting things happening at the state and local level, including in Virginia with the Republican governor. There's been some childcare worker wages, but some of it is a little bit more partisan. Some of these wage increases, including for long-term care, is coming more from Democrats, but especially on childcare, it seems to be more bipartisan. So I didn't know if any of the conversations in your group reflected any commonality. Did you find, had this been in the remit, would that maybe have been an area of potential collaboration and opportunity?
Yeah, it's all excellent points. I do think that was an area that ran into, so in childcare in our group, there's a divide between which point taken that they flow freely in between the quality of the childcare workforce impacts families, understood. But one level down, I felt like we hit a more fundamental debate about why are other people paid to watch kids and not parents? And there was a lot of tension between kind of stay-at-home parenting and formal childcare. And we couldn't square that circle particularly well, which is why we ended up with creating more options to stay home, more options to work part-time, and more accommodative workplaces, more care options, both in a center and with a faith-based organization or, family and friends. But we were kind of down at that root of the problem and sadly weren't able to address the childcare workforce issue specifically.
We have a question.
Well, this conversation is timely because today Muriel Bowser released her budget where she zeroed out augmented pay for childcare workers. Anyone want to offer an opinion?
Sorry, I'm taking a moderator prerogative to say I'm deeply disappointed by the announcement today. In fact, it was at a Brookings event that was held just a few months ago that I attended that Belle Sawhill, our colleague, hosted around paid leave and other early childhood interventions. And we lifted up the example of Washington, D.C. as exemplary. There's an incredible program here, if you're not familiar. It's called the Pay Equity Fund. And it basically, D.C. has made a commitment to put childcare providers on par with school teachers in terms of pay based on education. So if you have a bachelor's degree and you work in early childhood, you get the same as you would as if you were a teacher. And it's sort of scaled down based on educational attainment. So it means for a childcare provider up to about a $12,000 or $13,000 a year bonus. And it's really important in a city like DC, which I have 3 young children. I've benefited from our free pre-K 3 and pre-K 4. That it left quite a disparity, that we had an early childhood school-based workforce that was well compensated and just terribly low paid childcare providers who were many times on public assistance. I mean, it's just criminal in my view how low paid the childcare workforce is, given they are looking after our future human capital and our loved ones. I was been very proud to be a DC resident knowing this program existed. I've talked about it to many other states and cities and lifted it up as one of the best examples in recent years of a state or a city really investing in a childcare workforce. I think it would be a mistake for DC to do this, and I think it's very disappointing. In fact, what I'm hoping to see is more cities and states doing interventions like this, as opposed to taking away, I think, what is a model example. I mean, I've talked to folks in New York City about it and other places as a model to replicate. So I would say this is deeply disappointing news. I hope it's not the end of the story, and I appreciate your question.
And maybe to wrap it on that and on your question, there's so much that we disagree about, so many issues that we didn't cover or weren't able to reach, whether it's education or healthcare. And yet, there are 25 pages and a cumulative 1,000 hours of places where there is broad agreement and that could move forward. And I do think that can get lost in our national conversation. And I would love to see the pieces where there's agreement move forward with urgency.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes, okay, great. I'll take.
I mean, just in reference to Muriel Bowser, I mean, one of the main problems with it is the growing economic inequality that exists in this city. In other words, there's no proposals to say that people that make the most money should pay more in taxes so that we can have the available resources to provide better paid job slots for early childhood development and things like this. And I was wondering whether or not that type of issue of growing economic inequality was tried to be dealt with in any of your discussions.
And before I pass it, I just want to make the point that the early childhood pay for teachers is actually funded by a tax on the wealthiest DC citizens. So it's actually quite an interesting example. But this question of economic inequality, or even how we pay for some of these programs, was that a topic?
Certainly the latter piece of it and how we pay for these programs. And in this case, a recognition that we spend so much of our relative resources at the later stages of life and so relatively little at the beginning. And that, you know, I suppose part of me is still a conservative to say we're in a relatively unprecedented fiscal situation. Raising taxes alone isn't going to do it. And so our report talked about reallocating spending and where to do that from. So I think that's an important piece of it. And certainly the broader economic conditions impact families and all of these issues. I think our report was getting to a level deeper than that, though, and it was saying the economics matter, but also the relationships, also the feeling that families can raise kids according to their values, feeling of resilience when there's setbacks. That it was part of the tension in our group. All of a sudden, it became kind of everything or nothing. Like in the beginning, we were trying to scope and what gets included because everything kind of impacts it to some extent. And what are we exactly trying to do? Because there's any number of different kind of North Stars we could choose for supporting families, not all of which kind of lattice together in a comprehensive way. So all that is a long-winded way to say that income inequality is not explicitly addressed in the report. And there's lots of reasons for that. But we're also intentionally trying to broaden out just beyond economics too, and talk about the broader picture of what it's like to be a young kid in America today. And that has other factors in there also.
Final question. We're heading into an election season. There's going to be a lot of issues discussed. What about this experience gives you some hope for what's ahead for family policy? Is there anything that you're taking away that gives you some optimism, either about a specific proposal or even just this approach that makes you hopeful?
I'm going to start with the pragmatic part. So the U.S. has joined the Below Replacement Fertility Club that many countries in Europe and Asia already have been a part of. And so I do think that we are going to have the incentives to support families with young children are going to be even more paramount because we're going to be a shrinking society. We're not going to have a workforce to support Social Security, old age. So I do think that in the coming soon, hopefully, we should be seeing greater attention to how we can support working families because of our shrinking population size.
Yeah, I think I'm optimistic knowing that, you know, we had some strange bedfellows in this group and no one knew what we were doing until the report came out and all our names came out. In my organization, we talk a lot about secret Congress, that there's similar processes happening in Congress. Folks are working together. I think we'll all be working with them to come up with viable proposals that we don't even know what they look like yet until they come out and folks jump on board, hopefully.
And I was going to say the presidency clearly matters for so many reasons. I've worked on presidential campaigns, but in a country as closely divided as we are, a policy that's going to be able to have broad-based support from Washington, D.C. to Texas, where I live now, is probably going to come from Congress out as opposed to from the administration, because Congress is always represents just a sheer number of people, a broader set of interests than a single administration can. And because there are these existing and growing momentum around bipartisan efforts for cash support for paid leave coming out of Congress, that in some ways I've turned the dial on the presidential race way down and have my focus on Congress, on the 2025 tax package that Josh referenced, and on these bipartisan groups which are gaining momentum. So that's what's keeping me hopeful.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our panel. That was an excellent discussion. Appreciate it.
That was such a great discussion and such a great round of questions. And I'm so excited to have our part of it because when I sat in on that multi-hour discussion, I didn't know what to expect. And considering school board meetings regularly involve police breaking them up, I was nervous that it would be contentious in a way that was unproductive. And so I was so just impressed with the moderation, with the care and respect that everybody treated each other with, and the participants' willingness to engage in just such a good faith back and forth. And so, Stuart and Lindsay, if either one of you want to start with your involvement with Convergence and just the experience working in such a discussion.
I'll jump right in just because I have my mic ready. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to Brookings for hosting this conversation and for Convergence for their leadership. I was just in awe of the last panel because I think it's so refreshing today to have a conversation about reaching common ground. And so I think that this conversation is needed now more than ever. With Convergence, I am really proud to serve as a board member, and that journey started, I'm doing the math because it started when I was pregnant with my son, so he's now 6 years old. That started about 6 years ago when I was asked to join a dialogue on the broken budget process. And that was similar to the last panel, another sort of eye-opening experience of getting deep into the weeds on how do we come to consensus on addressing the fact that we're constantly moving from government shutdown to government shutdown, which is still very much the case. But through that experience, we were able to come up with some really strong policy solutions. And so through that process, I was really impressed by what Convergence was about. And it really spoke to, at my core, who I am is really about trying to find that common ground, and joined as a board member and have been part of this work ever since.
Thank you. I've also been a board member for many, many years at Convergence, and like Maya and Lindsay, been involved in projects. I've been involved actually with a number of projects, chiefly in the area of the budget process, which Maya and Lindsay were both involved in, but also mainly in the healthcare area and economic mobility, and one right now on social determinants of health. And just to sort of pick a few of the techniques, I think that's probably, in many ways, what I can indicate, having seen a lot of these different projects. And there's certain techniques, I think, which are very, very important in why these projects are so important and come to success. One is actually the use of professional mediators and facilitators for these projects, as in the one we're talking about today. And the importance of that is to have somebody in the room who's constantly, as a professional, sort of watching the conversation, watching the body language, taking a moment in the coffee break to just ask a question of one person and so on, to read the room, in other words. So I think when Abby described this as couples counseling, I think this is very, very much the case of a professional looking at people who are arguing with each other and getting to the bottom of how they can find agreement. And that's a very important feature. And you see this in almost all the Convergence projects. I think secondly, that the conversations often begin, and certainly this is an important element, of trying to get at what are the underlying values, vision, life experiences of people actually in the room. Because even if somebody's got a PhD or is a specialist in a certain area, they are still motivated by things that have happened to them and ways they see the world. One of the techniques we often use not all the projects, but a lot of them, is actually to go around the room and say, why are you personally interested in this issue? And you hear the stories. I've seen actuaries for life insurance companies tearing up, talking about long-term care and what happened to their parents. That shatters the impressions that other people have about what this person must be like. Because people come into a room and they tend to pigeonhole people. Oh, well, you're from the banks. We know what you people do, right? And so on. And these stories change the dynamics fundamentally. I think the third thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is again, what Abby mentioned. The projects do not just take a few days. This is a year-long process. This is not like the kind of bargaining where you say, we're all going to stay through the night here and reach agreement. We're going to lock the men's room and the women's room, and you're going to have to just come to agreement. It's not like that. It builds agreement over time using the techniques I mentioned and others. And that's a critical aspect of this. And we can talk more about some of these techniques, but taking the time is really important to get to agreement. You cannot push it too fast. And sometimes you don't get to agreement.
Maya, I'd love to hear from you about your experience working across the aisle. And hearing Stuart talk, I do think one of the sort of special sauce of this is that it is off the record. I think especially with social media, people can be quite wary of something that they are saying getting repeated, getting spun in a certain way. And so I wondered if you thought that sort of affected the way that people might work together in a more on the record fashion.
Okay, great. Thank you. Is this on? That's a button. Thanks. First, I will also, is it still on? Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you. First, I will also sing the praises of Convergence, because having done the process, I actually wish I could live my life with one of those mediators following me everywhere. It like brings out your best behavior. I feel like we should all, in every conversation we have, pretend one of those mediators is watching us. I feel like in a soon-to-be surveillance state, maybe that's where we'll be in a couple of years. That's maybe not a great thing, but with the Convergence folks, it really helps you to think about how you're interacting and having discussions, which I think is one of the great parts of the secret sauce. If Convergence ever asks you to be part of the process, say yes, you come away much better for it. And I'm also just going to give a plug, which is we need more foundations to fund them, because no matter what policy you care about, having the infrastructure that helps us get to where the yeses are is really, really important. And like Abby said, nothing's going to work unless there's going to be no durability in policies unless it has a broad support. So I just think the work's so important. Your question is about doing this in the real world. And so I do this in Congress these days. I'm trying to build support for fiscal policy. It's pretty easy. The left and the right don't support fiscal responsibility. And so there's that they agree on. But your question, I was just thinking about this, about off the record. Is it easier? It's so much easier. So one of my co-chairs is Leon Panetta, and he has overseen lots of negotiations, and he always says, like, nothing is agreed to till everything is agreed to. You can come up with certain policy agreements, but you have to see the rest of them. But the problem is, I don't think off the record exists anymore, and I'm thinking about the Capitol Hill group that I'm working with right now. They trust each other pretty much. A huge piece of this is building trust, building relationship, spending lots of time together, really getting to know each other on a personal level. I think one of the most important things in building this kind of trust is empathy, understanding, human connection that only comes from time and, frankly, some level of vulnerability. One of the best processes I've ever seen for this was in a different group I was working with, where we went around the table at dinner and said, what is like the worst thing that's happened to you on social media? And the stories were horrible. People had death threats and their kids being threatened, just awful stories. But people really opened up in a way that a very diverse group had huge, like, I am loyal to some of those people forever just from that one dinner. So finding ways that you can build connection and empathy really matter. But that's also important to trust that nothing you say is going to get leaked. But the bottom line is, I think the idea of off the record is over. I think it doesn't exist anymore. And it's sort of like everybody says, when you're saying off the record, just think about something that you wouldn't want it on the front page of the paper, but you still have to understand it could well be on the front page of the paper. So I think there's a huge loss in that. I feel somewhat connected to that loss because I spent a lot of time working on campaign finance reform stuff for a long time, and I always thought that absolute transparency in everything was the solution to a lot of stuff in policy making. And for me, it was one of those examples of something you push really hard for, turns out not to always bring with it all the benefits that you want. They're unintended consequences. But but I do think the solution isn't to believe that you have privacy and nothing will get leaked. It's going to be more of how you build enough connections to understand that the reasons you think other people are saying things or believe things might not be their reasons, and more about listening and asking questions where we're going to find the ability to do this.
So I'm very interested in that asking questions because that seemed to be such a big part of the process. It was sort of taking a moment and not just fighting back with your idea. It was saying, okay, let me pause and ask a follow-up question. So in addition to sort of what the kids call trauma bonding, which both of you said is a way to break down vulnerability, what are other ways to foster that connection and compromise among people who either have preconceived notions of each other or just have that desire to disagree?
Is that for anybody?
It's for anybody. I mean, Stuart, you seem to be jumping at it.
I was just going to give you an example, and then we might develop on it. One of the earliest projects we did at Convergence now, 10, 12 years ago, was actually on K through 12 education. We had people in the room from the two major unions. We had homeschoolers. We had charter school advocates and so forth. We had one terrible meeting where everybody just yelled at each other because they all focused on exactly what was going on right now, the issues before Congress and so on. So we went away and we just sort of regrouped. And we came back and said, let's not talk about any of that. Let's talk about your vision of what an education system should look like 20 years from now. Let's not even talk about today. And one of the remarkable things that happened is that we discovered that people's vision of the future wasn't as different as they thought it was. We were able to kind of begin to sort of build by looking at the future, the what if sort of scenario, and then start to kind of walk back to today and do it in that sequence, as opposed to let's get into what the issues are today and see if we can make agreement. So there are techniques like that can get people really off what they think of their position, and begin at least to entertain an alternative view. Because you're not asking what they're going to vote for today or advocate for today. You're asking about the future. And that's a technique we've used quite often in convergence projects to change the dynamic and get it out of the day-to-day. So that's one area, I think, one technique of dealing with what you asked about.
Yeah, I just add on to that, and I think the thing that comes to mind to me is leaning into the discomfort. And I think that we're all used to being in places and spaces where we are comfortable, right? We want to be places where we are with like-minded individuals, and we're not often in spaces where we have to be confronted with difference. And so I think what is really valuable about this process is that it puts it right in your face. You have to confront it, and you have to recognize that your assumptions and your biases about that difference might be not what you were expecting. So I think it's leaning into the discomfort, it's overcoming your biases and your assumptions. And as Maya mentioned, that comes from connecting as a human being, finding what are those areas where you have in common so you can get beyond those assumptions, because we all have them. And I know we've all seen the TED Talk about our brains being machines of inference, right? We make decisions every day based on assumptions and biases. But when we put those things aside, that's where the magic happens. That's where we can really dig into what the solutions look like.
Okay, I have two thoughts about one that helps with what works and one about what doesn't work. And so one of the things so we have this small sub-project of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget called Fix Us. And it's looking at the root causes, division, dysfunction, distrust. The argument for why we're involved in it is it's impossible to make progress on fiscal responsibility when you're so polarized that no one wants to do anything difficult. And right now, my colleague who runs this, Mike Murphy, he's in the midst or is just completing a project, Coleman Project, which is after Peter Coleman, who's written a wonderful book and article on this topic, but where basically people pick a partner from a different point of view and spend a lot of time, sort of a couple exercises, getting to know each other and just working on it over and over. And when I've done different things like that, one of the best pieces of advice that I've received and that really works is when you're talking about somebody where you disagree and you feel that feeling of kind of outrage boiling up, and I think outrage is the word that describes so much of the mental part component of polarization that we're feeling these days. You like feel it in your chest, it's tightening or wherever you feel it. You stop and you ask another question. And that's the only thing you let yourself do when you're feeling more angry and more argumentative. And it is a technique that I have found is brilliant. It does also work with couples. And it's a really valuable thing if you kind of need the other person to be doing it too, but just by doing it actually creates help for them to do it. There's also an example of what not to do. I was hosting a dinner and I had a meeting with 40 members of Congress, which is an incredible turnout, bipartisan, 20 and 20. And this is really a unique chance when you're trying to get people to work on something. And I decided the topic of this meeting was going to be all the things that you believe and tell yourself that are wrong. And so I said, okay, Republicans, you tell yourself that tax cuts pay for themselves. No, they don't. Okay, Democrats, you tell yourselves that you can print money or you don't need to worry about fixing entitlements. Whatever the thing was, I picked like some of the core fiscal myths that many of them hold on to. This was not greeted with warmth and connection. This was not like, oh, okay, we're wrong and you are right. It was the most hostile, blown event I have ever run. And obviously it was going to be, because it's just a terrible way to confront anything. There is no wrong or right. Well, that's not true. I'm going to take that back. There's a lot of wrong or right. Nobody comes to what they're doing believing they're doing it for a wrong reason. So if it really seems like what they're saying, what they're thinking, what they're believing makes no sense, back to asking questions, but trying to understand what the story they've told themselves to get there really helps. And this was sometimes for my team at work, I share the stories of my top 10 worst moments. And there's many, many of them. But this was really just one of the biggest wasted opportunities because I thought I would take my space to explain why someone else was wrong. And I don't think that can ever work.
So I sat in on this meeting right before Thanksgiving, and I just kept listening to the moderators and thinking many Thanksgiving tables would benefit from this man. But Lindsay, I was curious, I think if you did have a moderator at Thanksgiving, many family members would just be like, kick rocks. Like, you can't treat me like this. It's not this. It's a very, when people agree to be in the convergence dialogue, it's very specific. They know what they're getting into. How do you bring these lessons into your personal life in a way that people want to receive it? Because I remember sort of listening to it and thinking there were so many useful things, but it is much harder to do in a sort of casual interpersonal space. So I'm very curious about what works. What have
That's
you
a
seen?
loaded one. Wow, you really dropped the bomb on me there.
I'm going to take notes.
I don't have a silver bullet here
Okay.
for you, but I think for me, it's as simple as, and going back to what we've talked about, is putting your own, it's listening. At bottom line, that really is it, period. It's deeply listening and not, I think many of us, especially at the Thanksgiving table, are looking for our chance to speak, right? We're waiting for the person to wrap it up so we can make our important point. But at the bottom line is to look for opportunities to listen and to truly genuinely hear the person out and what they're saying, and also what is underneath what they're saying, right? There's what are the core values underneath what they're saying that you can connect with. And that really, I think, is the most important thing for all of us. I think that's what we need to challenge all of us to do, is how do we deeply listen in new ways? And this very much connects to my day-to-day work. I work with banks, and I encourage, I equip, I empower them to deeply listen to their communities in new ways. They may have assumptions about what the community wants. They may have had conversations with communities years ago. But if you don't have that regular, intentional engagement and conversation and listening, and you don't practice that on a regular basis, there are deep gaps that sometimes develop. And so I think whether it's at the dinner table or whether it's in the conversations in Congress, we've got to listen more.
If I could just pick up very quickly on that. That is so important, this issue of listening. But it's all, in addition, it's very important, whether it be the Thanksgiving table or a convergence project, to try to listen and find out what's really behind what that person is saying. And again, it's often due to either something very important, some value that they have, or something that's happened to them. We were all involved in the budget process project. And without mentioning any names, I'll just say at one point, we had a discussion, and the person, a proposal was on the table, and one person just kept finding every kind of, or you like, nitpicking problem with this. And I remember during a coffee break going out and saying, "Why are you really against this?" Right? And the answer was fairly straightforward. It was that, look, I've spent all my life fighting to ensure that low-income people have adequate health care. And what's being proposed here will undermine years of my work. I believe that could happen. Well, with that information, we were able to go back and start to think about how can we address that specifically. But he had never said this in the meeting itself, right? Does it sound like Thanksgiving? Or you know, husband-wife relationships and so on. So I think that's really very important. And that's one of the things that good leaders and facilitators are very skilled at doing. As sort of spotting situations where what they're saying is not really the reason. And that can be very, very important in terms of drawing conclusions and also avoiding you know, explosions by just, well, I think it's time for a break, you know, so just at the right strategic time to stop things going south, right? Or to say, let's avoid a break when things are moving,
Right.
to get something done. So don't upset the momentum.
So, you know, as the previous panel also mentioned, we are in an election year. And so, you know, Maya, I'm wondering, is there a way we can encourage productive dialogue as, you know, either as the media, in our lives, sort of any sort of public way that we can actually foster productive dialogue as we have these political conversations, and they will become increasingly fraught, I think, as the year goes on?
Such a complicated answer from how I see it. So because the stakes of this election and the past couple elections have felt higher to most of us than stakes in previous elections, there's a different dynamic going on. And that, well, first let me just say, it is a very, very strange thing to be a political independent in this town. You feel completely ideologically homeless. And it is a town of two teams. And even when people are saying, like, I want to do something that's bipartisan, a lot of people, because our organization is bipartisan, will come and say, how do you do something that's bipartisan? Here's what I want the outcome to be. And so I need, you know, someone from the other side to sign on. And so that doesn't, and there's nothing wrong with not being bipartisan. You don't have to be, but you sort of can't pretend to be bipartisan by picking one of the few known Republicans or Democrats you can stick on your commission and call it such. But this is I hope I can do what I'm trying to say justice. This feels like a different moment to me where suddenly a lot of people believe the outcome of this election, not just the presidency, but the majority of the House and or the Senate, is so important that it's not just the ends that matter. You're willing to sacrifice the means of how you get there because the ends matter so much. So does that make sense? Like, normally, there are many policies where there is lots of overlap. There are many issues where we can say sort of the political system is against this, or we can focus on the 80% of overlap, and that's where we should focus and do those things. But I think so many people right now feel that the outcome of the election matters to the point where they don't want to give the other side, whichever side it is, a single win. And so it's a really hard time to do what I think we normally need to do, which is focus on the zone of possible agreement instead of disagreement. When I think about it specifically for my issue, because what I look at is a campaign where we have two candidates who are going to promise lots of things they will give us, not a whole ton of ways to pay for them, with some exceptions where Biden talks about a lot of tax increases, and I guess Trump talks about tariffs, and a lot of promises of the things that they won't do. So I'm trying to think about, how do you come out of this without a mandate to avoid the issue of our national debt at all? And I think one of the things for the media is to try to figure out how you brief the media not to fall into just one side's perspective, to understand the perspective. So when they're asking questions, they're more pointed towards understanding both, not to go for the headline grabber, the more contentious thing. So if somebody says you're willing to raise the retirement age for younger workers, in most circles, that's a policy where most people would say, yeah, we should consider that. There's a lot of zone of agreement there. But now if somebody says I would contemplate raising the retirement age, reporters jump in because they know there's a lot of political risk in that one. So trying to figure out how the media doesn't play into this already tricky situation is one of the things. But basically my concern is, normally people will be like, well, let's focus on kids is something we should all care about. There's a ton of solutions there. But right now, the unwillingness to do anything that will help make the other side look good because the stakes feel so high creates a huge stumbling block to your question.
I think it's a good time to open up to the audience. So I would love anybody has questions.
Thank you. I'm Tom Dunn with the Convergence Leadership Council. The panel agrees that there's no silver bullet on how to practice this in our daily lives. I would certainly agree. The closest thing to a silver bullet that I've discovered recently, Rob Firsch actually recommended it, is a book by Bill Urey, one of our great supporters. It just came out, called Possibility. Powerful, and it explains how convergence does work without talking about convergence. Yeah.
Other questions? Is there someone?
My name is Dan Coughing with a, technology product called Objectively.ai. But my question first, by way of mathematical explanation, in the information age, the amount of information outside my skull just is vastly surpassing and accelerating beyond proportionally what is inside my skull. In convergence terms, that might be called intellectual humility. Where it gets at in this sort of polarized world is, do we see any new models emerging where I, as a person with an opinion, sort of diminishes, have sort of a smaller stake, have more perspective that, oh, the collective of knowledge exists outside me versus inside me. I should pound the table that much less. Does that make sense as sort of the mathematical view and what that might imply for how we conduct ourselves in any of our gesticulation or, sort of dogmatism, things like that?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I would say that we certainly see these days an increasing difficulty of trying to understand or identify what is the settled opinion on something, in science in particular, but other areas as well. And I think that's just going to get worse. I don't see any.
If I may, like the likelihood that any one person is going to be wrong proportionally is getting worse and worse.
I think that's so, yes.
And so that means, like, when I'm really getting dogmatic about something, then I should be that much more circumspect. And does that create a different psychology in your negotiation?
I think and also I just think that one of the things, and you just referred to it, was that, we're becoming almost more and more frightened by other people's opinions. You certainly see that if you look at the data on sort of what the Republicans think of Democrats and vice versa, or Trump supporters and non-Trump supporters, they're more and more fearful. I think that's a big concern. And I'll throw this back to you, Jessica, because I think the press, clearly the media has a very important role in this, which is not a big surprise. But I think one of the things I would suggest that the media and the New York Times do less of is use the word falsely. So-and-so falsely said X, for two reasons. One is sometimes it's not necessarily false, but secondly, it just irritates people, right? If I'm told, oh, well, that's just false, your opinion is false, it causes anger. So the attempt to try to get the reader to navigate facts, actually, in my view, sort of actually does not do that. It tends to just upset even more those people who oppose.
Well, I will say, I mean, we have a very high bar for using those types of words. I've seen many disagreements in the newsroom about this. But I will say one thing that actually gives me hope. I've done a lot of reporting on Gen Z and their political beliefs, and they are actually moving away from extremely aggressively stated political beliefs. The polling reflects this. I've talked to many of them. It's sort of a turnoff to have too aggressive a political belief because I think they're exhausted. They've just had so much rancor. Most of them came of the political age starting in 2016. They were not conscious for any sort of political dialogue before then. And so I am, even though they are sort of marinating in this just endless sea of opinion, I do actually have some hope that the result is not just further and further and further polarization. It is them saying, I don't like any of this. So that gives me at least a little bit of hope in all of this.
That's a really encouraging news. That is excellent news. In the Convergent fashion, I would like to disagree with Stuart, but agreeably. I really think it's important that the media is able to say false.
Yeah.
When there's a high standard. I think we're living in a world right now. Again, sorry. It's not you. It's not you. It's not. Feeling censored. Sorry. I think in a world where there's a lot of things that aren't true that are said, if you are as certain as one can be, I think it's very helpful when people make claims of fact that aren't. I wanted to address this question, not sure what you meant, but I'm going to address how I heard it, which was, one, I actually think there's always been much more correct or information outside of our brains than within our brains, even before the information age. We just are more aware of it with the information age. So I think that's been a truism that's always existed. Two, I think maybe you put your hand on part or your finger on part of why it is so upsetting as we start to see ourselves as a smaller role, both in the universe or maybe not the most evolved as technology becomes smarter than us in many, many ways that we see on a daily basis. That's very threatening. So maybe people try to hold on to their beliefs even stronger. And I think thinking a lot about how the shifts in technology are shifting our psychology, and so far in a way that seems to be harming our mental health and harming our abilities to get along, and thinking about how we change that could be an incredibly productive direction to think about AI and other technologies, big data, other things. But finally, I also think when it comes to public policy, it gives us an incredible ability to use crowdsourcing in a way that we haven't, where there are so many parts of policy that people can have opinions on, but there's no way for them to register. Referendums isn't necessarily the right way to do it, where you have decisions made, but there's a way to engage many more voices in discussions of different issues because of new ways of implementing technology in the policy space. And I think there's a lot of promise there.
Can I just add, I do think, just going back to, I know media always gets a bad rap, and there certainly is a role to play in lowering the temperature, right? But so much of it is driven by, going back to the Thanksgiving dinner table, it's driven by us. And I was really fascinated by some research that I saw about why the country and our politics are so polarized. It's because we're polarized. And so the Congress being polarized is a reflection of what our communities look like. The articles that are in media are a reflection of what people want to read. And so ultimately, it does go back to the conversations that are happening in our households, in our communities. And certainly Convergence has a process for us to address some of these intractable policy issues, but we as human beings have a role to play in that as well.
Can I disagree again, just because it's so fun to disagree on panels? Because we always tend to agree so much, but I actually don't think that's true. I think that the political environment, and I've looked at this for a paper I've been trying to write for 8 years, and it hasn't worked, so take this for a grain of salt. But I've looked at like all the theories of polarization, tried to read them to do kind of a polarization for dummies little paper. But one of the big things that contributes clearly is the way that primaries are set up, because primaries appeal to the extremes of both parties. So the people who are elected who aren't in swing districts tend to be much more extreme than many of the people in the population. And the second thing is that even though we may not feel extreme, we are drawn to extreme headlines. Clickbait works on the best of us, right? I try desperately not to click on clickbait, excuse me, but it pulls you in sooner or later. It will find the thing that like will get you there. And so you can actually create more of a sense of extremism by understanding that that's how our brains respond, and then creating ecosystems where we're not hearing the nuance that we used to have access to. So I'm not sure that it's really reflecting this polarized us as much as new forms of technology in our political system are pushing us in that direction.
And I think it's probably a both and to some extent, right? Like there's probably the sensationalism, right, in media is something that people are drawn to, but there's a reason why we're drawn to it, and then it perpetuates those sort of headlines. So I think I don't know that we fully we're in disagreement here. I think both of these two things are feeding into each other. That's creating this self-perpetuating cycle of polarization.
I think we all agree it's Jessica's fault, really.
Yeah.
It's all my fault. I think, do we have time for one more? Is it, even though we're over? Okay, we have one more. You choose. I can't be.
Hi, I wanted to pick up on your Gen Z point. Were there some young people included in your process? The other thing is, during COVID, one thing that did happen was that a lot of us were able to sort of zoom into top people's things, Bloomberg's meetings, World Economic Forum. And I thought there was a promise that once we got out of COVID, we'd try and act, more commonsensibly, or at least a lot of the younger generation thought that promise was made. So I was just wondering, did we learn anything from COVID, or are we learning anything from what the younger generation want? And did that come into your panel?
Two really good questions. I don't know if I know the answer to either of those. I'll just say that I know that there are organizations, and one of them also there's a gentleman who serves on the board with Stuart and I, who leads an organization that goes to college campuses and facilitates sort of a convergence process on college campuses. So those sorts of conversations are happening. But I know in our session in particular, it was mainly people working in these organizations, so we didn't have a younger perspective on that. And then what was your second part of the question?
Well, did we learn anything from COVID
yes.
in terms of promising that we would, do more commonsensical things once we got back together again?
I wrote a longer piece, which Abby spoke to me for earlier this year as the 4-year anniversary of COVID start. And I think there has been change, actual market change. I mean, the legislative process, as you in DC know better than anyone, is slow. It is very, very slow. But I have been covering these issues for 15 years, and I've never seen so much movement and so much actual progress being made. And is it, I mean, I think, there are some people who expect us to be Sweden overnight, and we're never going to be Sweden, ever, in any context. But I think that discounts a lot of the incremental change that has happened, particularly at the state and local level. And even with the setback in DC today, there's so many examples of movement forward sort of in paid leave and childcare. So specifically on the childcare front, I can't speak to sort of other convergence, but there absolutely has been movement forward for families, but it is slow. We're done. Well, thank you so much to Brookings and to everyone for coming, and to Abby for getting everybody together. So thank you. Oh, my pleasure. I see you back there. The headlines that are exactly as you said. Great.